anyone finer in the state of Carolina. If there is and you know her, show her to me. Dinah, Dinah, with her Dixie eyes blazing, how I love to sit and gaze in to the eyes of Dinah Lee, sweet Dinah Lee. Every night.
This lady, a gift from the French, has become over the past century the symbol of a powerful idea, that of a democracy offering to all those who come to its shores the hope of a fresh start in life. Yet it was Winston Churchill who, speaking to the House of Commons in 1947, declared, "It is said that democracy is the worst form of government, with the exception, that is, of all the other forms which have been tried from time to time." The millions, white and black, willing and unwilling, who have come here over the past 4 centuries since the time of the Pilgrim Fathers, have had an immense effect on music of all kinds, bringing as they did the varying seeds of their many cultures. When the Pilgrims arrived, they found a Native American music and culture which was then at its high point. Little did they realize that these Indian cultures extended over the whole of the North and South American continents. These were not one people, but many nations and tribes, each with its own beliefs, language, and tradition. It would be as false to speak of the Algonquin Cherokee or Aztec as one people as it would be to speak of Europeans as one race. Strangely enough, this native sound was not to become part of the American musical mainstream. Within little more than 200 years, the Indian peoples were decimated and their culture rejected, much to our own impoverishment. Although the Vikings and others before them preceded the Pilgrims, the English were the first of our various American forebears to set foot on the coast of what is now Massachusetts, a name derived from the Indian tribe dominant in the area. The songs they brought with them are still sung from New England to the hills of Appalachia. This music was shared as a companion to the hymn book as the number of settlers increased. The early English song, Barbara Allen, is known in so many versions now throughout America that one can no longer be certain of the true original. To the north, the French were well established in colonies stretching from Nova Scotia inland, and to the south as far as Mexico. The vigor and color of French folk music blended with the more pastoral English. Spanish had settled to the south among the islands of the West Indies and on the mainland. On these idyllic islands, they shared space with the French and English and the Dutch. In Jamaica, to this day, the steps of the French quadrille are danced with an unmistakable Spanish lilt and carriage of the body, while the dancers and some of their instruments have their roots in Africa. These lands were brought slaves from Africa, some of whom mixed with the Carib Indians native to the area. A few fragments of that ancient Indian culture still survive, the fruit of African and Latin conviviality. Slavery is as old a practice as prostitution, an exploitation of mankind by man as callous as it is lucrative. Since long before Egypt and Babylon, the conqueror made use of the defeated as so much disposable goods, and within decades of Columbus's landing in the West Indies, the native Indian population was virtually wiped out. Lying off the coast of Senegal in West Africa is this tiny isle of Gorée. These oozing walls, the chains and rings, are testimony of the whole terrible, callous tale of the African slave trade. From here, the French, English, and Spanish ships collected their living cargo. Hundreds of thousands were piled in these sweating cells, the able-bodied selected, while the old and infirm, and even tiny children, were left to die. Spirituals took shape slowly, influenced by the Protestant hymn book, and expanded as a result of the huge camp meetings, often lasting for days, which became so large a part of the popular social life as America was spreading west. These spontaneous gatherings must have brought a comforting sense of community to those courageous pioneers and their heroic wives and children. Despite the separation of white and black, one can imagine the voices mixing and blending as they echoed from camp to camp. In the ebullience of song and joyful faith epitomized by the revival meeting and the spiritual alike, you can sense man's unquenchable hope for a better life, the hope that has sustained the African in the New World for so long. The limbo dance is a vivid portrayal of the black man's dream of liberation, a ritual which withstands its use as a showpiece for tourists, mixing sensuality and savagery, fire and pride, which no amount of repression has dimmed. The Broadway tinsel in these Jamaican costumes cannot blind us to the unmistakable origin of these rhythms, part Latin from the Spanish conquest, part African from the slaves, rhythms into which these magnificent dancers fling themselves with such joyous abandon, and with that passionate freedom of movement which has always been theirs. In the New World, the rhythm and melody of Africa joined with the harmony of Europe to produce many distinctive new musical forms. One of these, closer to our own time, is the blues.
Well, I was sitting there one day.
As the spirituals speak for a whole people, so the blues speak for each individual, yearning for the comforting touch of another.
Lord, I was sitting on one now. What a man buys all my clothes. I ain't got business, but I got soul in my gold.
The extraordinary phenomenon of these United States lies in the fact that this entire culture is a transplant. Yet it is for the very reason that the immigrants brought so few possessions with them beyond those most precious of heart and mind, including their music, that given time and cross-fertilization and the great pressures of a vast continent, a distinctive flowering, a distinctive culture took root, resulting in music, in sounds and rhythms and compositions of great diversity and color. Part of that diversity was due to the piano, which became a fixture in the parlors of North America. As the West was conquered, the possession of a piano was the symbol of respectability and cultural achievement. In addition to folk and popular music of the day, Europeans had brought the fruit of their great culture, and no home could claim to be refined without the musical classics. Young ladies, sometimes painfully, applied themselves to learning piano reductions of the symphonies of Mozart and Beethoven, or the very latest novelties of Mr. Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, such as this overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. As the phonograph and radio were later to become, and spawned an immense printing industry. The world was suddenly aflutter with sheet music. The amateur, however negligible the performance, became thereby better acquainted with the heritage of the professional, bringing to the concert hall and to music generally an intrinsic understanding we have since largely lost. We have become aware of two main streams of the population of the United States, the willing from Europe and the unwilling from Africa, in an apparently inexhaustible flow. However, already the concept of the dominance over human beings was evolving from the quantitative and brutal to the qualitative and more selective, always moving towards the more general and abstract. From this grew the compelling moral obligation, as established in our Constitution, to provide an equal justice for one and all, with the exception, however, of those most native to the soil, the Red Indian. It was therefore inevitable that it would be here in America where the final confrontation would occur on the issue of slavery.
The Camptown ladies sing this song to die.
this period produced more than the confrontation with slavery. In music, it produced something permanent and prophetic, a rhythmic vitality and melodic gift which were later to result in ragtime and jazz. We already find these qualities in the songs of America's first great native composer, Stephen Foster. Many of Stephen Foster's songs first became widely known as part of a new brand of entertainment called the minstrel show, which became popular in the 1840s.
Finger over his back, oh doo-da-day. Then fly along like a railroad car, doo-da, doo-da. Run in a race with a shooting star, oh doo-da-day. Going all night, going all day. I'll bet my money on a bobtail bag, somebody will pay.
In medieval times, the minstrel was the people's entertainer, juggling and dancing in every town square. The Americans must have recognized how ideally the culture of the blacks filled this role in their own society with their talent for every musical and physical expression. Was it as a strange kind of wistful homage that the white man blacked his own face and attempted to reproduce the same spontaneous, humorous show? The songs of Stephen Foster sold in their thousands, becoming America's first popular hits, as they were called. His musical background may have been more limited than that which fed such a genius as Franz Schubert, but his output of songs was as great, and at their best, they have an eloquence and charm which Schubert would not have disdained. This is music of a rural America, of farms and country towns in a continent not yet industrialized. In the South, the great plantations flourished, but it was inevitable that all this would change, the towns linked by railroads and becoming big cities, the issue of slavery threatening the Union. That noble idea that diverse people in independent states could live in harmony was finally tested in the Civil War, American fighting American. The cost in human life and anguish of a nation divided against itself was tragic.
I long for Jeannie with a gay dawn smile, radiant in gladness, warm with winning guile. I hear her melodies in joys gone by, sighing round my heart are the fond hopes that die, sighing like the night wind and sobbing like the rain, wailing for the last one who comes not again. Oh, I long for Jeannie with a light brown hair, floating like a vapor on the soft summer air.
After the war, America industrialized swiftly while absorbing a veritable cornucopia of European music. Opera from Italy, the symphony orchestra from Germany, the café chantant from France, the gypsy from Romania and Hungary, and dear old Gilbert and Sullivan from England. American ingenuity combined this infinite variety in a marvelous array of musical contraptions, which became part of the circus, the traveling tent show, the local tavern, and even the home. As America had of necessity invented a completely novel form of government and quite literally built a nation in the short space of 1 century, so the same American capacity to create, together with their fascination for gadgetry, led to what must have seemed unbelievable at the time, the telephone, the light bulb, and to that amazing new medium, the moving picture. Now, concurrently with the movies, America produced a composer in John Philip Sousa who ideally captured the spirit of his time. Born in Washington, D.C., Sousa had worked for a period as musical aid to that inimitable master of French operetta, Jacques Offenbach. If you listen carefully to this sound, you will detect a whiff of French brass, seasoned with Wagner, but its dash and swagger and sheer good humor are straight American. An America on the march. Edison's electric light was changing the look of cities everywhere, and along with Sousa's marches illuminated the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. This American music gave voice to the spirit of national pride which so dominated Western life in the 19th century, as it did to the spirit of the settlers who fought to dominate nature and free this continent for themselves. All that America meant to those escaped from the confines of Europe is in this music, which seemed to say to one and all, like the Statue of Liberty, leave your oppressions behind and come to this limitless new land where everything is possible. They came from Europe by the thousands, landing first here at Ellis Island. People were realizing in ever-growing numbers that within their own hands they held the responsibility for the quality of their own lives. I've often said how I wished there were no need for national frontiers. They are only compromises true neither to tribe, to weather, geography, nor in fact often to the dominant language, each of which should in fact determine its own boundaries. Here, however, particularly in the 19th century, with its tidal waves of European immigrants, a totally different evolution occurred. Many cultures were gathered to form one. And through this one port of entry, this Ellis Island, a large part of the United States was peopled. Indeed, my own parents set foot here. It is difficult for us today to imagine this desperate pilgrimage compounded of courage, uncertainty, fear, and hope. Meantime, Europe was sure of herself, moving almost in a state of bliss, a dream of security.
Do what you can, and we'll let the chorus go.
There was some fighting in the colonies, in Africa and India, but all that seemed romantic and brave. Western culture was surely the center of the world.
And if you go pull you through. Then as though a ray of sunshine cast a halo round the place, stood a child before the footlights with a smiling angel face. Dad's been ill, she murmured softly, and if me you will allow, just to let him rest this evening, I will sing for Daddy now. Then a strain of sweetest music wafted o'er the spacious hall. After the ball is over, after the break of dawn, after the dancers leaving, many a heart is aching. If you could reach them all, many a heart that is aching after the ball. As she bowed her thanks and left the stage, all eyes in haste would ride. Those who heard her must have blessed her on the night the gallery cried. Sing us one of the old songs, George, one of the songs we know. Try, old man, do what you can, and we'll let the chorus.
But while the poor and underprivileged were leaving a Europe that had offered them nothing but want or war, the privileged classes, enlarged by a vast number of those to whom new industry had brought prosperity, sought in the calm brought by a near generation of peace new ideas for the expression of their arts.
So sing us a song, and if you go wrong, we'll help to pull you through.
Toward the close of the century, while London was the administrative center of the world, Paris was its artistic heart. There emerged a style in painting, poetry, theater, and music as far removed from crude actualities as is the case in a dream world. The Impressionist painters, Manet, Cézanne, Monet, and a host of others, had abandoned line and form for light and color. In 1894, Claude Debussy gave the first performance of his L'après-midi d'un faune, the afternoon of a faun, taking his inspiration from a poem of Stéphane Mallarmé, a poet of like mind, for both relished the sensuality and bewitchment of sound. Mankind, always a step behind its artists, was revolting against the harsh regimentation, the urbanization of its life. The Debussys and Manets, as had Turner before them, were restoring to humanity their daydreams. It was also in 1894 that Sigmund Freud abandoned hypnosis and concentrated on his patients' dreams in an attempt to reach their inner selves. Debussy's adventure into infinite space and light, so typically French, had, as its counterpart in Germany, music of a different density. Richard Strauss, heir to Wagner as generalissimo of German music, offered the jaded world a music that was bigger in sound, more grandiose, more bemedled than ever. Nonetheless, it was beautifully melodic and refreshingly free of either myth or cant. But it was deeply in love with heroic Germany. roots, still nourished by the compost of thousands of years of great civilizations, were nonetheless in need of fresh matter to feed upon. Concert music had already been encouraging and fulfilling dreams for a long time, helping to keep them alive. However, at the turn of the century, the great and overwhelming masterpieces of Wagner and Strauss carried, no doubt innocently, an ominous undertone which, perhaps like the mad structures of King Ludwig, reflect to us now a growing European arrogance and unreality, anticipating perhaps our own age of nightmares made real. Into this period of a changing balance of roles, there emerged from the dying Austro-Hungarian Empire yet another gifted composer, Gustav Mahler, born in 1860 in Bohemia and to this day honored as one of Vienna's leading musicians. His 9, may I say often interminable symphonies, vacillate between uncertain glory and resigned despair. Gustav Mahler shouts into the advancing dark, while bent on making his symphonies after the image of Beethoven, as if he could save what was already lost, smothering his fear of inexorable change. Such music is part of that self-confident age of colonial empire, with its delusion of limitless expansion and growth. It is like that rich, sweet wine one gets from those last grapes left on the vine until just before the first frost. They've already started to pucker, but one can almost think they might hang on forever, getting better and sweeter. But you must pick them on time, otherwise they spoil. Mahler and Strauss convey something of that unique flavor. And now, entering a new century, the melting pot of the new world produced more than gadgets. With a voice all its own, it created a new music, sharp and witty, the piano rags of Scott Joplin and his many peers. Scott Joplin's father was an ex-slave. Now, this music was being composed and played by blacks and whites alike. In this music, you hear combined the rhythms and the spirit of Africa and Europe. You hear park bands, Wild West, and the favorite airs and tunes the immigrants brought with them from both continents. The Africans contributed that swagger we call syncopation, which had all but disappeared from Western music. It is a nice thought that ragtime was carried by the currents of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers up and down between St. Louis, Sedalia, and Kansas City. But it was in New Orleans especially, where it was accepted wholeheartedly, not least because it was found to be ideally adaptable to that lively exercise for which the red light district of the Vieux Carré was rightly famed. Where musicians could be sure that the oldest profession in the world would furnish them with a steady income. Yet another form of popular music soon joined ragtime. And that was the male quartet associated with the barbershops, the American version of the madrigal come four-part hymn.
At night, dear heart, for you I pine.
Imagine the luxury of having the bristles shaved off your chin to this jolly accompaniment.
My dreams, your fair face beams, you're the flower of my heart, sweet Adeline, sweet Adeline.
Two technological revolutions accelerated the distribution of music and the change from live participation to passive listening, the phonograph and the movies. The phonograph made Enrico Caruso the most famous tenor of his day. But the musical influence of the movies was more subtle and indirect. America honored its early movie houses by the splendid title of Nickelodeon, a neat blend of slang and classical Greek. I find this grand name totally acceptable, for nothing like the movies had ever existed before. The two-dimensional screen carried black and white images of the joys and sorrows of everyday life. An imaginative leap forward from the unreality of puppet shows or opera. But the movies were silent. There were no voices to help us laugh or cry. This vacuum was filled by the movie pianist, throbbing away with his snippets of Grieg and Mendelssohn, Bashing out his bits of Wagner, knitting them together with improvisations of his own, he taught a whole generation music. For the first time, a sound could be heard again, and not only recollected and evoked in a mind's memory. Thanks to Thomas Edison's inventiveness and the new technology, continuous happenings could now be recorded both visually and orally. But until the two techniques were married, it was up to the pianist magician to infuse life into the mute images on the screen. And in this way, European instrumental music was heard in all the cinemas of the North American continent, whilst at the same time, thanks to home recordings, the great voices of the opera singers of the age were known in every parlor. And in this way, the North American continent became, musically speaking, an extension of Italy and of Europe. This is the oldest recording ever made in public. You are listening to the great Australian soprano Nellie Melba in Faust by Gounod at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York on March the 4th, 1901. The protagonists of the evening, audience and singers alike, are no longer with us, but the excitement remains. Early acoustic recording techniques were so limited that many musical instruments had to be modified so that they could project their sound into the giant ear. This freakish violin, in fact, has two speaking horns, the first example of that separation of sound into one for the public and another for the performer. Deep instruments such as the double bass could not be recorded at all. Fortunately, the system responded well to the human voice, and when the flat disc was introduced, it quickly overtook Edison's cylinder, and the phonograph industry became a worldwide success almost overnight. One lone American composer knew that music itself was changing and evolving, Charles Ives. Born just a decade after the Civil War and given a solid academic musical training at Yale University, Ives decided to make life insurance his profession and compose on the side. Between 1900 and 1918, he wrote some of the most forward-looking music ever conceived, music without any precedent, experimenting with multiple rhythms and cross harmonies well before any other composer in Europe. This you can clearly hear in the Housatonic at Stockbridge from his 3 places in New England. Ives had great confidence in an America no longer dependent upon Europe for its culture, an America assuming a new role in the world. But America dismissed the music of Charles Ives, and by the time Europe's modern music reached America, following the horror of World War I, Ives had ceased writing altogether. In Europe, the painters had begun to produce strange new images, no longer tethered to past conventions, rejecting mere appearances. It may be a good thing that realism had been stolen from them by the camera, for they were forced to find new paths to reveal what lay beneath the surface. Art and music turned inside themselves, taking apart their basic raw materials and combining them anew. Some experiments led to dead ends, others to fresh beginnings. For some, such distortions of apparent reality were rejected. What the artists produced was as dislocating and yet exciting as that age-old dream of flying in space. In fact, flight itself had caught the imagination of the whole world, raising confidence in man's godlike and omnipotent powers. Thus, while America was pursuing a progressive development, Europe was approaching that inevitable fragmentation of ancient traditions which disclose new horizons and new conceptions. Music such as Anton Webern's 5 Pieces for String Quartet, written in Vienna in 1909, was a clear signal that our world was on a collision course. The musical temperature continued to rise until the very eve of the Great War and came to a head with Igor Stravinsky. We owe this whole development to that phenomenal Russian, Serge Diaghilev, creator of the Ballet Russe in Paris in 1909, a man whose vision made an impact on the cultural life of the 20th century, still felt to this day. Diaghilev had an uncanny flair for choosing unknown but promising talent. To name but a few, Picasso and Bakst designed for him, Ravel and Satie composed, and on stage Pavlova, Karsavina, and Nijinsky danced. Diaghilev brought Stravinsky from St. Petersburg to compose in quick succession The Firebird, Petrushka, and at last, in 1913, The Rite of Spring. Why is it that The Rite of Spring is undoubtedly Stravinsky's most celebrated work? Simply because it broke like a storm, demolishing the barriers between East and West with an explosion whose repercussions can still be heard and felt in all kinds of music, even in film scores and rock bands. From its origins in Russia, that mysterious Byzantine land still largely unknown, this world of sensuality and fire, of color and new sound, came with the Diaghilev Ballet to Paris and London. The Rite of Spring, danced here by the Maurice Béjart Ballet, was surely, at its first performance, the noisiest scandal Paris had ever known. Nonetheless, Stravinsky soon became the idol of Paris and lived the rest of his life in exile from his native land. But his uniquely Russian voice is as much part of the revolution that was to shake his nation as it is part of that transformation of Western life brought about by the Great War, by technology, and by art. The artists knew, well, most of us, that things were changing. Boundaries were dissolving, and we could no longer rely on the protection of national fences. It was both a warning and a challenge.